Hello, everyone. Welcome back to JeyB Tech Academy, and welcome to Lesson 13 of our SQL Server Mastery course. In our previous lesson, we learned how to organize query results using the order by clause. We discovered how to sort data in ascending order, descending order, and even by multiple columns to create clean and professional reports. Now let's imagine a real-world situation. Suppose your employee's table contains hundreds of thousands of records, or maybe even millions of records. Do you always need to retrieve every single row? Probably not. Most of the time, users need only a small portion of the data. For example, your manager may ask for the top 5 highest-paid employees. A sales manager may want to see only the latest 10 orders. A school administrator may need the top 3 highest-scoring students. In all these situations, retrieving every record is unnecessary. This is where the top clause becomes extremely useful. The top clause allows us to retrieve only the number of rows we actually need. This makes our queries faster, our reports cleaner, and our applications more efficient. In this lesson, you'll learn how to use the top clause with a fixed number of rows. You'll also learn how to combine top with the order by clause to retrieve meaningful results. We'll explore top with %, understand the with ties option, look at common beginner mistakes, and apply everything in practical real-world examples. By the end of this lesson, you'll know how to retrieve only the rows that matter instead of loading unnecessary data. This is one of the most practical and frequently used SQL features in real business applications. So let's get started and learn how to retrieve only the rows you need using the SQL Server top clause. Imagine you are working with a database that contains 1 million records. Your manager asks you to generate a report, but the report needs only the top 10 employees with the highest salaries. Would it make sense to retrieve all 1 million records? Of course not. It would waste time, consume more resources, and return much more data than the user actually needs. This is a very common situation in real-world applications. Users usually need only a small portion of the available data. A manager may want the top 5 highest-paid employees. A sales executive may need the latest 10 customer orders. A principal may want the top 3 students based on their marks. A dashboard may display only the 5 best-selling products. In all these situations, returning every record is unnecessary. Instead, SQL Server allows us to retrieve only the required number of rows. This is exactly why the top clause exists. The top clause tells SQL Server to return only the first specified number of rows from the query result. This makes the query more practical and easier to use. It also reduces the amount of data sent to the application, making reports cleaner and more focused. However, there is one important point you should always remember. If you use the top clause without the order by clause, SQL Server may return any rows from the table. If you want the highest salaries, the latest orders, or the best performing students, you should always combine the top clause with the order by clause. Throughout this lesson, you'll learn how to retrieve the first few rows, how to return the highest or lowest values, how percentage-based retrieval works, and how to avoid common mistakes that beginners often make. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to retrieve exactly the rows your users need without loading unnecessary data. Let's begin by understanding what the top clause is and how it works. Now let's understand what the top clause is. The top clause is used to retrieve only a specified number of rows from the result of a SQL query. Instead of returning every record from a table, SQL Server returns only the number of rows that you request. This is especially useful when you're working with large tables containing thousands or even millions of records. Let's look at a simple example. Suppose an employee's table contains 1,000 employee records. If you need to display only the first 5 employees, you can use the top clause. SQL Server reads the table and returns only the first 5 rows in the result. The remaining rows are not included in the output. This makes the result smaller and easier to work with. The basic syntax is very simple. After the select keyword, we write the top keyword followed by the number of rows we want to retrieve. For example, top 5 returns the first 5 rows. Top 10 returns the first 10 rows. Top 100 returns the first 100 rows. The top clause is widely used in business applications. Managers often need only a small summary instead of a complete report. Dashboards usually display only the top-performing records. Reports may show only the latest transactions or the highest values. Instead of loading unnecessary data, the top clause retrieves only what is needed. This helps improve the efficiency of applications and makes reports much easier to read. However, there is one important thing to remember. The top clause only limits the number of rows returned. It does not decide which rows are returned. If you need specific rows, such as the highest salary or the latest order, you should combine the top clause with the order by clause. We'll learn that in the next slide. Once you understand the top clause, you'll be able to write SQL queries that are faster, cleaner, and much more practical for real-world business applications. Now let's learn how to use the top clause with a specific number. This is the most common way the top clause is used in SQL Server. Suppose an employee's table contains 1,000 records. If your manager asks you to display only the first 5 employees, you don't need to retrieve all 1,000 rows. Instead, you can use the top clause. Simply write the select keyword, followed by top, and then specify the number of rows you want to retrieve. For example, top 5 returns the first 5 rows. Top 10 returns the first 10 rows. Top 100 returns the first 100 rows. The number inside the top clause tells SQL Server exactly how many rows should be returned. This makes your query simple, efficient, and easy to understand. Let's look at the example shown on the screen. The query uses select top 5 from employees. When SQL Server executes this query, it returns only 5 rows from the employees table. Even if the table contains thousands of records, only 5 rows appear in the result. This reduces the amount of data sent to the application and makes the output much easier to read. However, there is one important point you should always remember. Using the top clause by itself does not guarantee which 5 rows will be returned. If you need the top 5 highest salaries, the latest 5 orders, or the newest 5 customers, you must combine the top clause with the order by clause. We'll learn that in the next slide. The top clause is used in many real-world applications. Managers request the top 10 performers. Sales teams view the latest orders. Customers see the newest products. Dashboards display only the most important information. Instead of loading unnecessary data, the top clause helps us retrieve only the rows we actually need. This makes our SQL queries faster, cleaner, and much more useful in real business scenarios. Now let's learn one of the most important best practices when using the top clause. Using the top clause alone limits the number of rows returned. But it does not guarantee which rows you will get. If you want meaningful results, you should combine the top clause with the order by clause. Let's understand this with an example. Suppose your manager asks you to display the top 5 employees with the highest salaries. If you write only the top clause, SQL Server simply returns the first 5 rows it encounters. Those rows may not contain the highest salaries. The result may be completely different from what your manager expects. Now let's add the order by clause. We sort the salary column in descending order. Then we use the top clause. What happens now? First, SQL Server sorts all the employee records from the highest salary to the lowest salary. After the sorting is complete, it returns only the first 5 rows. As a result, you get the 5 employees with the highest salaries. This is exactly what the business requirement asks for. The same concept applies in many real-world situations. If you want the latest 10 customer orders, sort the order date in descending order and then use the top clause. If you want the 5 most expensive products, sort the price column in descending order and then use the top clause. If you want the lowest priced products, Sort the price column in ascending order and then use the top clause. Always remember this simple execution sequence. First, SQL Server sorts the data using the order by clause. Then it applies the top clause and returns only the required number of rows. This is why professional SQL developers almost always use the top clause together with the order by clause. It ensures that the returned rows are meaningful, predictable, and exactly what the user expects. Whenever your requirement includes words like highest, lowest, newest, oldest, best, or latest, always think of using the top clause together with the order by clause. In the next slide, we'll learn how to retrieve a percentage of rows instead of a fixed number by using the top % option. Now let's learn another useful feature of the top clause. Top %. So far, we've been retrieving a fixed number of rows. For example, the first 5 rows or the first 10 rows. But sometimes, a business requirement is different. Instead of asking for a fixed number, your manager might ask for the top 10% of employees, or the top 5% of customers, or the top 20% of products based on sales. In these situations, SQL Server allows us to use the top % option. Instead of specifying a fixed number of rows, we specify a percentage. SQL Server then calculates how many rows that percentage represents and returns those rows. Let's understand this with an example. Suppose your employees table contains 100 employee records. If you write top 10%, SQL Server calculates 10% of 100, which is 10. It then returns the first 10 rows from the result. Now imagine the table contains 1,000 records. Using top 10% will return 100 rows. Notice that we don't need to calculate the number ourselves. SQL Server performs the calculation automatically. However, there is one important rule you should always remember. Just like the top clause, top % should also be used together with the order by clause whenever you want meaningful results. For example, if you want the top 10% of employees with the highest salaries, first sort the salary column in descending order. Then apply top 10%. This ensures that SQL Server returns the highest paid employees instead of random rows. Top % is commonly used in business reporting and data analysis. Companies use it to identify the top-performing employees. Sales teams use it to find the top-selling products. Schools use it to identify the top % of students based on marks. Financial analysts use it to retrieve the highest-performing investments. Whenever your requirement is based on a percentage instead of a fixed number, top % is the perfect solution. In the next slide, we'll learn another powerful feature called with ties and understand why SQL Server sometimes returns more rows than you requested. Now let's learn one of the most interesting features of the top clause. With ties. To understand why we need with ties, let's look at a simple example. Suppose your manager asks you to display the top 3 employees with the highest salaries. You write a query using the top 3 clause together with the order by clause. Normally, SQL Server returns exactly 3 rows. But now let's imagine something different. The first employee earns $90,000. The second employee earns $85,000. The third employee also earns $85,000. And the fourth employee also earns $85,000. Notice something important. The second, third, and fourth employees all have exactly the same salary. If you use only the top 3 clause, SQL Server returns only the first 3 rows. The fourth employee is excluded, even though the salary is exactly the same as the third employee. This may not be fair. That's where with ties becomes useful. When you add the with ties option, SQL Server checks the last row that is returned. If there are additional rows with the same order by value, SQL Server includes them as well. In our example, instead of returning only 3 employees, SQL Server returns 4 employees because the third and fourth employees have the same salary. This ensures that employees with equal ranking are treated fairly. The with ties option is commonly used in ranking reports. For example, when identifying the top-performing employees, the highest-scoring students, the best-selling products, or the top sales representatives. Whenever multiple records share the same ranking, the with ties option ensures that none of them are left out. One important point to remember is that with ties works only when it is used together with the order by clause. Without the order by clause, SQL Server cannot determine which rows are tied. Always remember this simple rule. Use the top clause when you need a fixed number of rows. Use top with ties when you want to include every row that shares the same ranking as the last returned row. In the next slide, we'll look at some of the most common mistakes beginners make while using the top clause and learn the best practices for writing accurate SQL queries. Now let's look at some of the most common mistakes beginners make when using the top clause. Understanding these mistakes will help you write more accurate and professional SQL queries. The first and most common mistake is using the top clause without the order by clause. Many beginners believe that top always returns the highest or the latest records. But that is not true. Without the order by clause, SQL Server simply returns the first rows it finds. Those rows may not be the ones you actually need. Always remember that if your requirement involves the highest, lowest, newest, oldest, or best records, you should always use the order by clause together with the top clause. The second mistake is assuming that top permanently removes data from the table. The top clause does not modify or delete any data. It only limits the number of rows displayed in the query result. The original data inside the table remains unchanged. Another common mistake is forgetting to choose the correct sorting direction. For example, if you want the highest salaries but sort the data in ascending order, SQL Server will return the lowest salaries instead. Always make sure the sorting direction matches your business requirement. Some beginners also confuse the top clause with filtering. The where clause decides which rows should be included. The top clause decides how many of those rows should be returned. These two clauses work together, but they serve different purposes. Another mistake is using the top clause without checking the returned data. Never assume the result is correct just because the query executes successfully. Always verify that the returned rows match the business requirement. Professional SQL developers always review the output before using it in reports or applications. Finally, remember this simple best practice. If you need a fixed number of meaningful rows, combine the top clause with the order by clause. If you need a percentage of rows, use top %. If multiple rows share the same ranking, use with ties. Choosing the correct option will help you write SQL queries that are accurate, efficient, and easy to understand. In the next slide, we'll apply everything you've learned today to real-world business scenarios and see how the top clause is used in professional SQL development. Now let's see how the top clause is used in real-world business applications. Learning the syntax is important, but knowing when to use the top clause is what makes you a professional SQL developer. Let's begin with an employee management system. Suppose the human resources manager wants to identify the top 5 highest-paid employees. Instead of displaying every employee in the company, we can use the top clause together with the order by clause. SQL Server sorts the employees by salary and returns only the top 5 records. Now let's look at an online shopping application. A customer opens the home page and wants to see only the latest 10 products. Using the top clause with the order by clause, SQL Server retrieves only the newest products instead of loading the entire product catalog. This makes the application faster and improves the user experience. Next, imagine a sales management system. The sales manager wants to see the top 10 best-selling products for this month. Using the top clause, SQL Server returns only the products with the highest sales. This helps management quickly identify their best-performing products. Let's consider another example. In a school management system, the principal wants to display the top 3 students based on their examination marks. The data is sorted by total marks in descending order. Then the top clause returns only the highest-ranking students. Now think about a banking application. A branch manager wants to review the latest 20 customer transactions. Instead of displaying thousands of transactions, SQL Server returns only the most recent records. This makes the report much easier to read and analyze. These are just a few examples. In reality, the top clause is used in almost every business application. Employee reports, sales dashboards, inventory systems, hospital management, banking applications, student management systems, e-commerce websites, financial reporting. Every one of these systems uses the top clause to retrieve only the most important information. As a SQL developer, your goal is not to retrieve every record. Your goal is to retrieve the right records. Returning only the required data makes applications faster, reports cleaner, and business decisions much easier. Always remember this simple principle. Don't retrieve more data than you need. Retrieve only the data that provides value. In the next slide, we'll quickly summarize everything you've learned in this lesson and get ready for our next exciting topic in SQL Server. Congratulations! You've successfully completed Lesson 13 of our SQL Server Mastery course. In this lesson, you learned one of the most practical and frequently used features in SQL Server. The top clause. We started by understanding why retrieving every record from a large table is often unnecessary. Then we learned how the top clause helps us retrieve only the number of rows we actually need. After that, we explored how to retrieve a fixed number of rows using the top clause. We also learned that using the top clause alone does not guarantee which rows will be returned. Next, we combined the top clause with the order by clause and discovered how to retrieve the highest salaries, the latest orders, and the most important records in a meaningful way. Then we learned how to use top% to retrieve a percentage of rows instead of a fixed number. After that, we explored the with ties option and understood how SQL Server includes additional rows when they share the same ranking as the last returned row. Finally, we discussed the most common beginner mistakes and learned the best practices for writing accurate and professional SQL queries using the top clause. Always remember that the top clause is not just about limiting rows. It is about retrieving the most relevant information. Returning only the data that users actually need makes applications faster, reports cleaner, and business decisions more effective. Now it's your turn to practice. Open SQL Server Management Studio and try every example from this lesson. Retrieve the top 5 records. Retrieve the latest 10 records. Experiment with top%. Try the with ties option and observe how SQL Server returns additional rows with the same ranking. The more you practice, the more confident you'll become in writing efficient and professional SQL queries. If you found this lesson helpful, please like this video, share it with your friends and colleagues, and subscribe to JeyB Tech Academy for more beginner-friendly SQL Server tutorials. Also, don't forget to turn on notifications so you'll never miss our upcoming lessons. In our next lesson, we'll learn the distinct clause and discover how to remove duplicate values from query results to retrieve only unique records. Thank you for watching. Keep learning, keep practicing, and I'll see you in Lesson 14. Closing message. Professional SQL developers don't retrieve more data. They retrieve the right data. See you in Lesson 14.